The Method Writer by Chris Harvey. Steam hung like a milky curtain in the small bathroom. Martin Lee stepped out of the shower, pulled the curtain closed behind him, and smiled, a broad, contented smile that really summed up how he felt. It had worked. The shower had done the trick and had given him the idea for his next story at last. He snatched up the large bath towel hanging on the rail and vigorously scrubbed his body, then rubbed his hair dry and reached out a hand to wipe the steamed-up mirror. A reddened face smiled back at him, and he shot a glance at his wet, spiky hair. He looked into his reflection's eyes and widened them, then examined his teeth and decided that he'd better give them a clean. Well, there's no immediate rush. He wanted to get started on his story as soon as possible, but he had time to brush his teeth. In fact, he thought as he squeezed the toothpaste onto his brush, there was plenty of time. He certainly wasn't going to forget this idea. It would be his best story to date, and he was impressed with himself. He finished brushing his teeth and spat the toothpaste froth into the sink. Then he rinsed out, dabbed his lips dry with the edge of the towel and raised the corner of his mouth into a grin, still unable to believe that he had got his story at last, and that he had got it in the shower, of all places. He pulled on his bathrobe, and the heat it had absorbed from the radiator warmed his goose-pimpling flesh. He let out a breath, stepped back and gazed appraisingly at his reflection in the semi-steamed-up mirror. Well, he looked all right, felt fit and healthy, and he wasn't that bad looking either. But looks didn't really matter to him, at least not his own looks anyway. It was the grey matter inside his head that was important. Not that he didn't bother with his appearance. Look good, feel good, was his philosophy, and it was always well turned out. Just like he had been on that first night that he had met Kathy. And it certainly hadn't been his writing abilities that she had had her eyes on when she first saw him. He'd been seeing Kathy now for about 5 months, and they'd been living together here in his flat for not much less. He'd met her one night when he'd gone out with a friend. The friend had brought his girlfriend, and she'd brought her friend Kathy. He and Kathy had got talking, seemed to get on well, and he'd certainly found her attractive. Brunette, big blue eyes, cheekbones like wing mirrors, and slim. In fact, the sort of girl that everyone would regard as good-looking. One thing led to another, and before he'd known it, they'd slept together and he was asking her to move in with him. And everything was fine. He'd grown fond of her, and she seemed to feel the same way. But that had been 5 months ago. Recently, over the last 4 weeks, their relationship had started to go downhill. Kathy was staying out late, and the natural suspicions had started to niggle, though ever so slightly at first, in his mind. Was she seeing someone else? Martin sighed, and his mind faded from thoughts of Kathy and back to his precious story. The steam was beginning to thin out in the bathroom, and he decided it was time to prepare for his 6 or so hours at the typewriter. He preferred to work at night. He was able to concentrate more, and the ideas seemed to flow better. He opened the bathroom door and stepped into the hall, his feet sinking into the thick pile of the carpet. The fibres felt good between his toes, and the heat enveloped him. He felt really good, warm and comfortable, and with a strong desire to get to work. He flicked off the bathroom light. As he stepped into his workroom, another smile crept across his face. Every time without fail, the room had very much the same effect that a playroom had on a child, for everything he needed was in this one room. Drinks cabinet, many books and magazines, some containing his own work, trinkets and mascots, cuddly toys given to him by Kathy, and of course his desk, his typewriter perched on top. Various pens and pencils stood in pots and holders, and in the far corner stood a tall filing cabinet where his original manuscripts were kept. He moved over to the drinks cabinet, poured himself a whiskey, then sat down at his desk. He lifted the glass to his lips and took a large slug of the amber liquid, wincing as the liquor burned its way down to his stomach. He let out a breath and put the glass down, then reached for a sheet of A4. As he fed the paper into the typewriter, he tried to think of a title for the story. It didn't matter what it was at this stage, just so long as he had a heading at the top of the page. He thought of one quickly and grinned as he began to type it. It was bad, corny, and a dead giveaway to the story, really, but it would do for now. For now. He sat back and drank some more, allowing his eyes to wander around the room as the liquor warmed his insides and he pondered over his ideas. He thought of all those times he had sat here in similar fashion trying to think of that elusive next story. Then the smile faded from his lips. He had been so overjoyed with getting the idea that he had forgotten just how long it had taken him to get it, and all the trouble it had caused between him and Cathy. She had nagged him to have a break for a couple of weeks, to leave the typewriter and the paper and the horror and the death so they could spend some time together. He told her that he couldn't possibly yet, that there was no way he could even consider taking a break until he had written at least another couple of shorts. She told him that he was becoming obsessed, that he was putting her second. Surely he could afford to take a couple of weeks off. Eventually he had promised he would take a 3-week break when he'd finished just one more story. But she still wasn't happy. She nagged more and more and eventually gave him an ultimatum. Either he had a story finished in 3 weeks or she was moving out. And that was when it had started to get really bad. She had gone out that night and had only come in close to 3 in the morning, well and truly drunk. He was still up, sitting in his workroom as now, desperately trying to find that precious idea, but there was nothing. His imagination remained dry and barren, and now frustration and anxiety were combining also to aid the mental torture. Cathy staggered into his workroom, reminding him of her ultimatum, asked him sarcastically if he'd finished it yet. He wasn't in the mood, told her to go to bed, but after yet more nagging and throwing up on the carpet, and that really was too much. She was incapable, and he'd had to carry her upstairs and put her moaning and semi-conscious into bed. That had been day 1, just over 3 weeks ago. And since, things had just grown worse and worse. Cathy kept telling him how obsessed he was becoming and that he didn't give a damn about her, and she was staying out more and more often later and later. But worse than that, she began to insinuate that there might be someone else. It had been a slip of the tongue, so she had made it seem, for he knew that she could be a good actress when she wanted to be, and he wouldn't put it past her to try and wind him up by lying. He tried not to let it get to him, but he was no closer to getting started on the story, and he was getting wound up and frustrated more and more. Martin managed to smile again and drained the remainder of his whiskey. He could afford to smile now. The last 3 weeks had been pure hell. Never before in his writing career had he had such a severe dose of writer's block. But now, it was all over. As he placed his empty glass down on the desk, his hand rubbed against one of Cathy's cuddly toys. It was a little penguin which she had bought him a couple of weeks after they'd started seeing each other. He remembered the day only too well, but right now he tried to push the memory out of his mind. He gently stroked the penguin with the tip of his finger, a wry grin breaking at the corners of his mouth. Shifting his eyes back to the paper in the typewriter, he stared at the lousy title and cringed. It would have to be changed. It looked even worse now. He glanced up at the clock. 2:27. Returning his eyes to the penguin, he contemplated the idea that Cathy had been seeing someone else. He wasn't jealous anymore. He was past caring. He had better things to think and worry about. But he couldn't help wondering all the same. And then, suddenly, he stood. And still holding the penguin, he turned and walked out of the room, promising to change that lousy title when he got back. In the bathroom, the steam had fully cleared. The room was quite chilly due to the open window, and Martin moved over to it and pulled it closed. It would start to warm up now. His face was impassive as he turned to the shower. The curtain was drawn fully closed. He reached up and in one sudden movement threw it open. Kathy's wide, dead, glazed eyes stared up at him, an expression of pure terror still etched into her broken and smashed face. Her teeth were broken, her nose fractured. One of those wing mirror cheekbones was caved in. She was still fully dressed, her black stocking legs splayed apart. One of her high heeled shoes lay near the plug hole, and nearly all of her red-painted nails had been broken, ripped off as she clawed desperately at the walls for her life. He hadn't meant to do it, but tonight had been the last straw. She had gone out again. More frustrated than ever because he still hadn't got a story, he'd got really depressed. It was suddenly all too much. He'd had a few drinks to see if that would help. It hadn't. So he decided to take a shower. A nice, hot shower. Well, maybe that would help. And then he'd heard the key being turned in the flat door. Kathy. He prayed that she wouldn't start tonight, hoped desperate that she'd just go straight to bed. But it was too late. She was already in the bathroom, pulling the shower curtain across. She was really drunk again, started to grab at him. He inched away. She started nagging again, called him weird and a wimp, asked him if he'd finished his story yet. His back was pressing hard into the tiles behind him and he couldn't back away any further. He watched her heavily made-up face contort and crease, her blood-red vicious lips curl and pout, her eyes bulge out of their sockets, heard her brag that she'd found someone else that night, someone who could show her a really good time, someone who had done just that. He'd only grabbed her head to shut her up. But the next thing you knew, he dragged her into the shower and was pushing her face into the wall. She was a lot weaker than she should have been because of the drink, but that didn't stop her screaming as he'd mashed her face into the tiles. He'd heard bone cracking and giving as he'd rammed again and again, Kathy's arms and legs punching and kicking for dear life, but he was too strong for her, and he'd had quite enough, thank you very much. Before he was even fully aware of what he was doing, Kathy had gone limp and soft in his hands. And quiet. He let go of her and she fell to the floor of the shower. He looked at her face and into her wide, lifeless eyes. She looked scared. It was at that moment that he had got the idea. It just came to him, a vital spark igniting the flame of his imagination. He smiled, then laughed, and pushed his head under the hot shower spray, closing his eyes and knocking his head back, his smile widening further as the spray pelted his face. He couldn't believe it. Now, after more than 3 weeks, he had got his story at last. What a way! What a method! Martin snapped out of his reverie and remembered that he was still holding the cuddly penguin. He stared down at it for a moment, then threw it into the shower with Kathy's corpse. It bounced off her chest and came to rest in between her legs. Now, it really was time to write. In his workroom, he poured himself another drink, snatched the piece of paper with the lousy title on it out of the typewriter and scrunched it into a ball. Then he fed in a fresh piece, smiling again as he ridiculed the lousy title to himself. Death in the Shower. Dear me, he had a much better one than that. He quickly typed in 3 new words and sat back, taking a drink as he admired them. The method writer. He repeated them to himself, liking the sound of them much better. Then he drained his glass and repositioned the typewriter carriage. He had 2 more words to type before he could get started on the story proper. A name. His name. Not his real name, of course, but the alias, the pen name that he always used when he wrote. He finished typing the name and rubbed his hands together. Now, he thought, what about that opening sentence?